everyone. My name is Rob Formichael, coordinator of INNATE. This network has had a rather unsuccessful project on civil society and the Troubles to document the work done by different elements of civil society in Northern Ireland in relation to work on dealing with issues arising from the Troubles. So, I mean, civil society, thinking of the different constituent parts includes trade unions, women's groups, community groups, churches, peace and reconciliation groups, and others. And so this seminar fits into that, or a little corner of that, because it's looking at some of the peace and reconciliation work. And we feel it's important that there is an alternative narrative of the Troubles and the possibilities that existed, so that state and paramilitary narratives are not the only ones in town, and that they are challenged. The idea of looking at Irish peace movement history also came from INNATE's link with the War Resisters International, which is currently celebrating its centenary. We're not so naive to think that 6 people speaking for 10 minutes each can cover the multitude of issues and more than a smidgen of what needs recorded. Instead, I would prefer to say it's dipping a toe into the waters of the work which needs done. We'll be aiming to follow up on this and the next seminar, which is on international work, international peace issues in Ireland next week. We'll be aiming to follow it up, and we'd welcome suggestions and collaboration on that. And we're already planning further sessions, one on Quaker contributions to peace and one on AVP, the Alternatives to Violence project. We also seek comments and additional information for our accompanying paper on peace groups, which I think probably all the people that I've seen so far will have received. It's a draft document looking at chronology of peace groups over the years, and we ask for your help in correcting that and adding to it. So you can contact us by email. That's not intended for discussion in these seminars. It's a supporting document which we would ask your help with. And we'd also welcome comments about this seminar or the next one. After the speakers are finished, we'll be moving into breakout or discussion groups, but I'll say more about that later in terms of how we divide up into those. And to enable time for discussion, speakers have been told that they'll be given a 2-minute warning at 8 minutes. So they finish within 10 minutes. And this is not our attempt to be rude to the speakers. Anyway, so if you can, and I think everybody I see that I can see on screen has already muted themselves, if you can stay muted except when you want to speak. But there is the chat facility, and I would encourage you to use that to make comments or to kind of raise questions. And this is only the start, hopefully, of a process. And it's a limited event, but we're very much looking forward to. We've got lots of dynamic speakers, and we're very much looking forward to that. I would like to introduce then our first speaker, who is Anne Patterson. Anne has been a long-time activist on peace and other issues, has been very involved with the Peace People, and professionally she worked for Quaker Cottage Family Centre in West Belfast. So Anne, over to you.
Hi Rob, thank you very much, and thanks very much for bringing us all together. I'm so delighted to be able to listen to all the other speakers, and I'm glad I was first because I'll not be nervous now. Well, I think because time is very limited, I'll just rattle on here. I was born just after the Second World War. I was going to say the First World War, but I was born just after the Second World War. My father was a soldier in the Second World War, and he was an absolute hated war. He hated everything about it, just saw the British just totally and utterly glorifying what he thought was a horrendous time in his life. And he hated the whole lot. And so he brought me up with a very strong social conscience, which was wonderful. In the late 60s, I was always involved, even as a young child, I was involved in things. But in the late 60s, I joined CND and the civil rights movement, and absolutely loved being involved and doing things with them. But then the violence that came onto our streets around that time was becoming absolutely awful, and it was invading every aspect of our life. And the violence was just all around us, no matter where we went, there was violence. And then we got the military, came into Northern Ireland. They were always here, but they came on our streets. And with that came an intensity to the violence that was really very, very difficult. When you were working, I was working north and west Belfast, and it was very difficult to go back home to Carmoney, to my wee village, and just leave it every night, seeing the devastation. You were going in the mornings, there was more devastation around. But I got together with some people and we made a little group, and we decided that we would take turns at the weekend and do a human shield against when the soldiers were coming back to their barracks at night in Dover Street and Garwood and the Antrim Road. Sometimes kids would throw stones at them, and then they would get out and there would be rioting and whatever. And so I got involved with some Quaker people when we were doing that. And that involvement carried on. We did that for quite a long time. We also got involved with the community, with the lots of people in the community. The women would come out and thank us because they didn't want their sons getting hurt. And sometimes the soldiers would stop and thank us as well. So it was an odd time. It was an odd learning experience for me as well. And then 71 came internment, which was to me the most horrific thing that could happen. And I volunteered with another part of Quaker organisation, and we used to go and meet families, mummies and daddies and sisters off the train coming from all over Northern Ireland, or the buses, and take them down to the Maidstone, which was docked down in Belfast and at the harbour. And we used to take their parcels, and it was really a heartbreaking time, because these women and men had no idea why their sons were there, most of them. Most of the ones that I met and talked to, their sons weren't involved in anything. And you could just see that this was absolutely wrong. It was wrong for everything. But you were young, I was very young, I had no power, you couldn't change it, so the most I could do was volunteer. And during the 70s, the violence just started to escalate, and it escalated to a stage where every day there was more killings. And I think somewhere along that, we all lost our soul, because I used to sit and write a wee note to every soldier that had been killed, or to a policeman, or to a paramilitary's mommy. A lot of paramilitary people I had worked with on both sides, and I used to write a wee note, post it to them, just to say you were sorry, and then you stopped doing that because there was really too many notes to be written, and whenever that happened, I started then to am I still on, Rob? Hello?
You're still on, and you're still speaking, and you're fine.
Sorry, I went off screen there, sorry. And I thought because I've just got new internet. Anyway, sort of lost the train of thought there. Anyway, I think we just sort of lost our soul. And then one day there was the horrific, and everybody I'm sure listening will know that the three children, Maguire's children, were killed. And that day was a horrible day, an absolute nightmare of a day. And I remember driving up and going along and seeing, is there anything you could do? And somebody told me there was going to be a vigil at the chapel at Andersonstown. And I drove home to make my children their tea. And my neighbour was out, and she was the headmistress of our local school. And I said to her, there's a vigil tonight up at that. I think I'll go to it. Do you want to come? And she says, oh, sure, what good does it do? For goodness sake, that's just more fighting all the time, And I just thought, that's just awful. So anyway, I went along to the vigil. The next day, I was with my group and the mummies group. I was facilitating a group, and the women in the group could do nothing but cry the next day. And I suppose it still makes me cry, but I remember thinking, you know, something has to be done. Then Maria had come on, and we went to the Ormo Park. Everybody come together, big rally in the Ormo Park. But still, it just felt to me like this is another thing. Nothing will happen. Nothing's going to change. You know, the violence was just horrible. And then we went to a rally on the Shankle Road. And I remember we had started a little peace group ourselves in our area, and we got a bus. We're all called to come to the Shankle Road and get a bus. So we got a bus in the area that I was living in. And first of all, we ordered a single-decker bus. And then we filled a double-decker bus. And when we got on the bus, I realised that when I stepped onto the bus, that I was the only person who had ever been active, ever done any sort of activism at all. And this was the first time for these women, and I was really proud to be with them. And when we got to the Shankle, we weren't that welcome in some parts, but it was lovely. When we got up to Woodvale Park, and this is what really changed me that day. When we got to Woodvale Park, I looked across and I could see banners all round. It was massive, massive rally. And I saw a banner from Ardoyne, and I seen a banner from Mountain View. And I looked and I could see I could see two women that I had been facilitated a group in Ardoyne, and they had been in together. And one woman from Mountain View had been burnt out of her home in Farrington Gardens. And her friend had under the banner from Ardoyne, and I knew they had never met when that had happened. And all of a sudden, those two women saw one another. And I was watching, and it was just wonderful. And they raced across and they hugged and kissed and hugged and kissed. And I thought, you see, that no matter what, those women want peace. That no matter what has happened, they want peace. And Maria, Kieran and Betty have given them that opportunity for them to be together and come together. And it to me was just absolutely wonderful, really wonderful. And I met those women many years later in the Shankle, at the Shankle Women's Centre, and they stayed friends for the rest of their lives. And it wasn't until many years later that they could go across the Shankle Road and visit each other.
And you've got 2 minutes to finish off, please.
Right. So that I went home that day knowing that we're never going to go back, that we're not going to go back into a box. We're never going to be told what we're going to be doing again. It might take a long time. It has taken a long time. But women definitely were able to claim the agenda and work for peace in every aspect of it. And I just think it was absolutely wonderful. For me, that was the day that I had great hope, and I've never really lost that hope. We have travelled the world together, Maria and I have talked to hundreds of grassroots organisations and just encouraged them to keep doing what they were doing, because that's what we did. We just kept doing what we were doing, which was bringing people together for peace. So thanks very much, Rob. And I hope that some people maybe learned something about me. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. I mean, I think you have some amazing experiences, and you've only just touched on a tiny bit of what you've been involved in, and we look forward to you continuing the conversation in your small group. Okay, we move on then to our next speaker, who is another Anne, although spelt differently. Anne Carr has been involved in Northern Ireland peace issues for a long time and has worked with Women Together and currently with Community Dialogue. She's a founder parent of All Children's Newcastle, the first integrated primary school developed by parents outside Belfast in 1986. And in recent years, she's been developing the Peace Process According to Women project, and currently facilitates workshops on reflection, acknowledgement and recovery with grassroots women in Belfast and Armagh. So, Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hold on. Can I go get speaker view?
Okay, we have you on so you're
Okay.
good.
Hello, everyone, and like Anne, I'm so delighted to be here. It's so lovely to see everybody, and I just see a little bit of white hair around, so more than I would have seen.
Nonsense, Anne. It's just
Well, I have very little of it.
just the color. It's just the color on your screen.
Very little of it. Yeah. Lovely to see you all. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history too, because I think it's really important, and it really has made me the person I am today. And I started off, I was born in 1952 in the Trudell Avenue area of Belfast. So I was on the Protestant side of Ardoyne, if you know what I mean then. And it was just after the war, and my dad had been in Japan also, clearing up after the Nagasaki bomb at 17 years of age, and home. My mum and dad were both from very, very poor families on the Shankle, and he had trained as an electrician at night classes. So he decided, and a friend, to emigrate to Canada because there was no work then. And my mum had two babies, and one was, she had one baby actually when he went, my brother, and she waited until I was born. So my mum traveled away to Canada, first time out of Northern Ireland, carrying two babies. I was 3 months old, my brother was 17 months old. So we lived in Canada for 12 years, and my mother had and I know that she'd worked in the mill in Belfast and didn't know her lungs had been quite badly damaged. So the humidity in where we were in the beautiful Niagara area of Ontario was too much for her. So we came back to that very house, which was my grandfather's house in Trudell Avenue in Belfast in 1964, and I was 12. Huge change for me, because I had, all my friends at that age of 12 to come back, and went to Glen Secondary School on the Ballymartin Road. And for me, having been brought up for 12 years in Canada, where, we were all educated together, we had friends from all over the world, really, who had emigrated to Canada. And I was back into the Ballymartin Road area of Belfast, and went to an all-girls secondary school, Glen Secondary School, which the intake was totally Protestant girls. And that was a huge shock for me. And from very early on, I could see the divisions and things. So I then enjoyed Glen for 5 years, but went to work in the civil service at 15. That was the end of my formal education. And then it was when I met very good Catholic friends from the Falls Road, and I also remember interment and everything happening, and to me it was just all so horrific. So anyway, a Protestant from West Belfast met a Catholic from South Belfast in the lovely dances of the early 60s before the conflict, where we all got on so well together. But one day I had saved enough to go back to Canada on holiday, and my boyfriend Terry then had stayed here and then went on his first holiday to Spain. It was only the night he went, which was the Sunday, the 6th of August, 1972, a gunman called at the door that night. They lived in Lower Windsor Avenue in West Belfast. There was only two Catholic families, or in South Belfast, two Catholic families in the street. And they knocked the door at 12 midnight, a guy on a motorbike and a pillion passenger, and asked for Terry by name. And luckily he wasn't there, but his brother was worried because they had felt very intimidated. This was 1972. They felt very fearful. They'd had bottles at their window. Anyway, 2 shots were fired through the window, front window, just missed Terry's brother. And they moved out the next day after 17 years, very happily living there and mixing with everybody. It turned out Terry played football in a cross-community football team. They got to know he was a Catholic, so they'd asked to speak to him about a football match. So if he'd been there, that would have been him. So he was away in Spain. I didn't hear until I went to work the next day. One of my friends in work lived next door, so that was it. We were leaving Northern Ireland. A group of cross-community, 9 of us from across the community said, that's it. And we went to London. By the time Terry came back, we were moving to London. We'd all given in our notices and away we went. We ended up, though, being very homesick, enjoyed London. It was brilliant, Mary Quant and the 60s and Oxford Street and all that. But back we came, but we got married in a registry office before we came back, and I couldn't tell my father for 2 years I was married to a Catholic because my mother was so afraid of what he would do. My father was a huge DUP supporter and was all his life. For me, it meant that I lived a life of fear, really. Finding somewhere to live was the big thing. And we eventually moved. We moved to Antrim for 3 years and then to Newcastle, where my then husband's family had moved to. So that started my life. But my children, I brought up as Catholic. I had 4 children. And as soon as I heard about Lagan College and educating our children together, that's what I wanted, because I didn't want anybody to go through what we'd been doing. We were 19 and 20 years of age when this happened to us, and we certainly felt that we had to find different ways of living together and sharing together and learning together, because the violence was just horrific, and so many were being killed. So that was me getting involved. I went along to the first meeting about all children's integrated primary school in Newcastle and was elected as the PR officer on the first night. And that began my 20 years with All Children's. And it was the most wonderful one, because if you go back to 1985, it was just before the Anglo-Irish Agreement. It was really difficult times. And yet we, within a year, had our school going in mobile classrooms in an industrial estate, starting off for 3 weeks in a church hall. And we gradually built to the most beautiful school that 20 years later, I left the day that I performed the official opening of our brand new school building. And just when I look back on those years, it's one of the most important things I've ever done. But in that time then, I was interested in moving things on and heard about, I had known about Women Together going from 1970. It was setting up groups in Belfast to try and keep children away from the Troubles, organised holidays for children, and really, did some difficult work in challenging paramilitaries in communities and keeping families safe. So I joined in 1990. Worked with Women Together until 2001. So I went in, on their 20th anniversary, and Pat Campbell, who was my colleague, and I started as part-time development workers. And we just worked with the women that had always been members, and then looked at what we needed to do as Women Together then. And like Anne, we started getting women together. We started what we called talking and listening circles, bringing women together to talk about the things that were left outside the door. You didn't talk about religion. You didn't talk about the Troubles. You didn't talk. We did. We brought them together, and that was the beginning of my interest in dialogue, which has continued ever since. We did a lot of campaigning as well and held a lot of vigils every time, like Anne. We were heartbroken every time someone was killed. We always brought flowers to the family about 4 weeks after their loved one had died, and apologized on behalf of all women and to what had happened, and said that we would work tirelessly to end the conflict. Unfortunately, my friend Pat Campbell's youngest son, Philip, working on the Moira roundabout, had a burger van while Pat was working with us, and we were planning a residential for women on the 9th of January 92, was also shot dead at that roundabout. And for Pat working, the 20 years before, and always looking to build a new society based on peace and love and trust, it was a huge, horrific event. It just made us more dedicated to keep going. So in those years, we did so much in, as I say, the talking and listening circles, organizing training for women, encouraging women to get confidence enough to work in their own communities, and did a lot of work in getting support for those who had been injured and bereaved in the Troubles. Yeah, so an important thing that I really wanted to mention was, if you go back to when we started in 1990, there was very little support for any families who'd been injured or bereaved in the conflict. So we contacted victim support, and it was Marion Gibson was the chair, and victim support couldn't do any work for those families. So we managed to talk to her, and we then set up a working group. That working group then got government interested in looking what support was needed, and from that came the Bloomfield report. And when I see today that at last the very, very injured have got a pension, I say that if we hadn't actually done that work then, where would we be? So my work with Women Together was the start of my journey in dialogue. Women Together eventually transformed to become Community Dialogue, and I moved from working for Community Dialogue to a post with them, and I'm still involved. I still work with women. I still bring everybody together, and will continue to do until, as I say, my feet are still on the ground, but until they're under. I'm committed to that work, because, as Anne said, women want nothing but peace at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Anne, for sharing that amazing journey. And again, you'll be staying with us and joining in the small group. So thank you for sharing. We now move on to our third speaker, who's Derek Wilson. Derek has been involved with Corrymeela since 1965 and worked for the Community Relations Commission's Schools Project from 1970 to 1973. He was director of the Corrymeela Centre and then involved with different teaching and action research programs on community relations at Ulster University. So Derek, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be with you this evening. I'll run through a number of images from my experience, and I'm very glad to be with everybody here. I've been very fortunate. I was always able to work in civil society untrammeled by over-anxious organisational restrictions. I was very fortunate. I'm also very fortunate that 50 years ago, the guy with a balaclava who put a gun to my head didn't pull it. And every day for the last 4 or 5 years, I have given thanks that that was the case. I think reconciliation for me has always about offering people a space in which we could all imagine and model what a contrasting future might look like if we could live well together in spite of the chaos and hurt around us. So I want to share some images with you. I don't know whether I'm on share, but anyway. One is a reconciliation offers spaces where private hopes could become collective hopes. And for me, one space was to join Corrymeela when I was 18, to be told that it was of no consequence that mixed groups were out. Well, I can laugh. A second space was working with John Malone's Schools Project. 4 of us worked across 4 inner city areas in 1970. John refused to separate poverty and sectarianism, arguing that such split mental models fed poor public policy and continued underachievement. Such thinking for him reinforced the notions of young people always being seen as problems, not as gifts to society. A third space was with other mad people. We ran a mobile youth club between 4 areas of Belfast, Short Strand, Sandy Row, the markets, and Glen. How we ever did that, I'm not quite sure. But also to work with teachers and youth workers in the focus group who for 20 years plus struggled to find education for mutual understanding policies, Norman Richardson and others among them. And for me, the fourth space was to be part of the Polytechnic experiment, where we were able to create the first in-service training course for youth workers in these islands. All people with loads of experience and few qualifications, all coming out the other end, the equivalent and the equal to anyone else in that profession, and able to work and contribute in a way that was quite remarkable. And in that group, I learned that it was possible to facilitate harsh and challenging discussions with people from all sides, the Bog side, the Shankle, Craigavon, and, well, I was going to say Coleraine, but that was the case. We experienced the intimacy of our honest differences, and we also experienced it was possible to stay together. I think the next thing is a step-by-step collective development of hope with people in the Corrymeela experiment. Here we were able to build north-south youth programs, 6 weekends a year with young people from Tala, Ballyfermot, Twinbrook, Rathcoole and many other areas coming together, then visiting one another's homes. This was in the 70s, and then going to Europe for joint visits. Over 50 years also, Corrymeela has been able to offer volunteering opportunities to young adults from Ireland, Britain and elsewhere. And the hope of several thousand young volunteers, I think, is also part of the peace process. The third dimension for me of this work is standing with the scapegoat. We are in a land of scapegoats and scapegoaters. So many excluding belief systems, our inability to acknowledge one another, and to say sorry and to take responsibility. The shroud of sectarianism has meant that so many other realities are often denied. Corrymeela offered ongoing support for victims and survivors who didn't wish for their lives to be politicised. It supported victims and survivors meet one another over many years, along with many other groups. And consistently from the early 70s until recent times, one of my experiences when I worked there was picking up weary families maliciously driven out of their homes, standing in the street in the middle of the night, only with a bag of possessions, often sheltering with the protection of a lone community worker or member of the clergy. We whisked them away and offered them short-term sanctuary. That was all that was possible in a scapegoating society. What a cruelty this society inflicted on them and many others. Or those in 74 who started the mixed marriage movement, again, because they had to deal with young people from working class areas in particular, not being allowed to have friendships across the divide. And in 82, ensuring a safe place where anxious and fearful members of the LGBT community could finally come together for a residential and avoid Save Ulster from sodomy and many others who chased them. Also offering accommodation and standing with vulnerable women and children who in those days were judged and condemned, unjustly stigmatized as single parents, and standing with other women who needed safety from abusive relationships. These were the real victims, in addition to the victims of the conflict that our society wished to ignore and not face. Meeting the human face of the victim for me was part of the reconciliation task, holding a space for reflectful and robust dialogue between many people. I well remember victims and survivors coming together with 18 years served former paramilitary prisoners, coming together with police officers and their families with disabilities in a space protected by Corrymeela and members of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I also remember weary weekends where many tired people from paramilitary groups gathered together to learn about Irish history and Northern Irish history, or whatever the history was that interested them. I think we've got to realise that reconciliation is about moving collective hopes to sometimes also become public hopes. For me, to belong to Millstrand and help set up an integrated primary school just a year after Anne had done hers in Newcastle is very important. 34 years on, it's still strong. And also establishing with other trustees the Spirit of Enniskillen award scheme that allowed a lot of young people from underserved backgrounds to avail of international experiences of reconciliation. And finally, for me, reconciliation work has given me the opportunity with others to develop charitable support about how we might research and argue for wider public and institutional cultures that supported reconciliation. The values of equity, diversity, and interdependence for me are real principles of what public policy should be. They made it into 2005 Shared Future, and then our sectarian politicians cast a weary eye over those terms, but they're still alive. We also need, with others, to really work to restore restorative practices in schools, hospitals, social care, community organisations, as well as the criminal justice system. We need more restorative and responsive human services. And finally, with colleagues, I was able to work for 7-8 years in support of Mediation Northern Ireland's ability to facilitate previously unimaginable meetings on the way to an agreed policing system, both before Patton and post-Patton. This 7-year programme of secret and private critical dialogues was about the changes needed in policing with the community and the outworking of those changes in view of the Patton Review. For me, this work, if we had the space, and I was fortunate to have the space, means a bit like Anne says, we have to take every opportunity still. Civil society, when energised and fully used, is a public space and could be a vital public space for citizen action that allows our personal hopes to be expressed and shared, to find that others share those so that some of them become collective hopes, and we acknowledge that with one another, and potentially then those collective hopes, and then collectively share again and develop some notion of a public hope, a wish we all might have to have a civil society and a public society that actually seeks to honour and treat one another with respect, acknowledge one another's difference, and build a really interdependent society. I wish you well. I have certainly enjoyed, and I'm still enjoying, because we had a weekend for 30 youth workers and teachers and mediators at the weekend at Corrymeela on our new material. And I think we all just have to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. I realized you were coming towards your climax and end there, so I didn't give you your 8-minute warning. Derek has also put together a document which has been sent out to you, which has as an attachment, so you can look at the links and so on and images there. So thank you, Derek, for sharing your vast experience with us. Moving on then to Geoffrey Corry, and I think it's important to note that while we're talking here about the situation in Northern Ireland, there are also people outside of Northern Ireland, in Britain or in the Republic, who have been involved with issues here. Geoffrey has been a family and workplace mediator since the 1990s. Indeed, he was one of the pioneers of mediation in Ireland, and he has often been in the north. He was involved in setting up community mediation centres and the Mediators Institute of Ireland. He was chair of the Glen Centre in the 1980s and involved there with different peacemaking projects over the years. So over to you, Geoffrey.
Good. Many thanks for that warm introduction, and Rob for the brilliant way in which you brought us all together to share these reflections, and hopefully these will be on record for many others, then to have the hope and to gain the hope and to keep the flames, well, maybe flame is the wrong word, keep the spirit going. What I want to do was just share a little bit about my own experience, and I have 1 or 2 slides here just to keep me going. I got involved with the Glen Centre, and you hopefully some of you have been there. If you haven't, then this is a lovely view of it at the top of the valley. And it's still going strong, even though it's been closed about 3 times at different moments because we ran out of money. We're going very strong at the moment. Much of the work is in the background. How we got started was, many people may not have known, but it did arise out of the Bloody Friday bombs in Belfast, and a group of people, and there you see the picture of Una O'Higgins O'Malley standing outside the Sinn Féin head office. And they got together, and one day, through contacts with government, Una and others looked through the gates of this old reformatory school and British barracks and simply said, wow, what? Here's the possibility of establishing something. And of course, in the back was a shadow of Corrymeela, because that was the model which we had hoped to follow. But in many ways, it was difficult to follow, and the early group wanted to see it as a Christian centre, but others who joined from a more secular south didn't quite connect with that. I became involved in 75 and on into 76, and became chairman in the 80s. So we were all grappling with this wonderful big concept of reconciliation. How do we do it? Particularly when it was still a kind of a Christian concept. And I got a great steer on it when Adam Curl came over in 1981. And it was these words that turned it from a kind of a visionary concept into a process, because he said it's the building of a new relationship of understanding between people. And that somehow connected with me because of my mediation experience and gave me a steer as to where we might go. And so we began to see that just inviting politicians and having them up on the top table kept the adversarial positioning going. And luckily, I met Herb Kelman, who had done problem-solving workshops with the Middle East in the early 1990s. And at that point, the centre had closed down. But luckily, we got the thing together again. And Chuck Feeney, I must honour him entirely. It was through his monies that we got the help of Ian White, who came from Cooperation Ireland and became the starting up of a new Glen Cree, and we got the buildings opened in 1994 and our first summer school. And then what happened was the ceasefires came, and it was just a golden opportunity. And from there, I launched these dialogue workshops with annual summer schools, and Ian did the work there, as well as getting Americans in to do interest-based negotiation skills. So when we tried to bring together the politicians, it was terribly important, the ground rules we set. And this first one was I think what held them in the workshops. We said the participants, you the politicians, you control the agenda. We're simply going to facilitate the process. And that, I think, gave ownership to them that they could feel comfortable with. And of course, it was within what's called the Chatham House rules, or what became Glen Cree rules of anonymity. And up in the valley, where there were no phones, and you could come away for a weekend, it was a great relief for them to spend time together. And this was the type of weekend structure that we had. Coming in on a Friday evening, some of them came down by train, the 6 o'clock train from Belfast. We would pick them up at 8 o'clock. It would be 9 o'clock before they'd hit the centre, and it would be about 10 o'clock before we'd have our first session. Some of the British participants would just go to bed around 12 o'clock, whereas of course us Irish, we'd stay on and have a great old chat, and we had an honesty bar which helped us to keep together. And of course those informal times became as important as the actual sessions themselves. So we were blessed. We did this work over 7 or 8 years, and it turned, we in the end, we did over 50 workshops. And we were, obviously all of these parties didn't come together in each session. They came together in different combinations. When we started out, the Sinn Féin people unionists wouldn't meet with Sinn Féin. So we had sessions with between Southern politicians and unionist politicians. The next weekend we'd have Sinn Féin in, and the SDLP and Southern politicians could let them know what were some of the concerns of unionists. Having the Brits over was also important, and having the British Embassy and the American Embassy involved as well was a huge learning experience for some of the young politicians. We're talking about people in their 20s, early 30s mainly, and they were just hungry for politics, hungry to be able to sit down and work together. And we had this beautiful fire in a small Glen Cree room, and it just was the right atmosphere, not sitting around any table or anything, but obviously in comfortable chairs or sofas. And I came across this North American native Indian saying, you talk and you talk until the talk begins. That's what happened. We discovered it through our nose, if you like, but this is belongs obviously to a huge native tradition that has worked in other circumstances. And this is in subsequent years, I found this sort of standard classic definition, almost academic definition of what dialogue is. And it says it's the flow of meaning and understanding, which is a connection back to Adam Carroll, between people gathered and, what's important, thinking together in an interactive relationship. Now, that's all very fine, and it's a lovely definition, but I think the thing that we brought to it in our circles was what from my mediation process was storytelling. The chance that Southern youngish politicians could actually hear the unionist experience in the room of how they grew up.
Two more minutes.
Only 2 more minutes, okay? And so what I discovered, and some of this it really comes from a Carl Rogers point of view, but how it's not just sufficient in a circle to be heard, but it's also terribly important to be understood. And if we can go a third layer, to be acknowledged by the other side, that's absolutely huge. And I think we didn't achieve that all the time, but we achieved it a good lot of times. And we began to coin this language that dialogue and circles, what they achieve is humanizing the relationships between people. So if we are trying to make sense of all of that, the networking that grew, the fostering of hope when people weren't sure where the peace process was going, and it was going up and down, and the sharing and the constraints that the other side had. These were all important learning experiences within the workshops. What I didn't know until many years later was what was happening in between the workshops and the next one. And the relationships that were built between party people, I'm calling it pragmatic trust as the years went by. And what we discovered was that other things were happening. Well, I've only discovered it since, because they were confidential, they were behind the scenes. And that some of those people were linking straight up into the top leadership and top governments and officials. And so as a process, as a model, our dialogue workshops need to be seen as and I've written it, I've tried to write it up, but they have been a huge contribution to the peace process as they developed. It's a story that we need to let people know about, alongside all the other stories that are now part of peace process history.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for sharing on that. It's a tremendous program that you were involved in, and fascinating detail on that. So thank you. Moving on then to our penultimate speaker, who is Mary Fitzduff. Mary was the first director of the Community Relations Council in Northern Ireland, and subsequently director of INCOR at Ulster University, and a professor and founding director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Brandeis University in the USA. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Can I first say just how amazing it is to be able to see everyone here together. I love Zoom. I love the fact that it can help us do this. And just looking back at the work that everyone has done and recognizing how much that enabled us to get to where we are. Well, I was a blow-in. I arrived in Arbo in 1976 with my husband, Niall Duff, as he was then. And we arrived in it was a very troubled time. The terrible death rates of the early 70s had gone down, but there was unceasing trouble, and particularly in a place like Tyrone. I think where we lived was actually called the Killing Fields of County Tyrone. It was the second highest murder rate in Northern Ireland. And we were doing our best trying to go to the different funerals of those who were killed, etc., etc. But there was one morning when, I suppose I call it my Damascus morning, when I remember opening the door. It was in the early 80s, and I opened the door to a young group of British soldiers, and there was an officer in charge. And I remember the officer saying to me, "Is there anybody in your house who shouldn't be?" And I couldn't for a moment figure out what he meant. And then I remembered that just previously, about half an hour previously, I'd actually seen the IRA practicing out in the far field. And there was this moment where I thought, and I had 2 young children, 2 young boys, and this moment when I thought, here's one young group of men. The soldiers probably signed up because they couldn't get any other jobs. Here's a young group of Sinn Féin IRA men who can't get jobs because they're Catholics, and they're about to murder each other. And I thought, this has to stop. Something has to be done. So living in the middle of the country, it took a while to sort out what could be started. But one of the first things I remember was offering to do courses on mediation in Queen's University. And that was because I actually had started with Relate doing mediation. And I thought, well, maybe this is something we could apply at a group level. And so I nevertheless, I set up this first course and about 15, 20 people turned up. But the really funny thing was that half of them thought they were coming to a course on meditation, not mediation, because the word was so unusual and they didn't know what it was. So subsequently, there was a group of us. Adam Curl was there, Sue Williams, Joan Broder, Oliver, I'm trying to remember his second name, and myself. There was a photograph of us that I think is lost now, but the setting up of the Mediation Northern Ireland service, which I think turned out to be an extremely useful one. I know, Jeffrey, you did a huge amount of work in Dublin on validating this, as many other people did. But at the same time, I was also conscious that in Northern Ireland, talking together was very difficult. And I was aware that there had been, I think, Derek, you might have been some of these Tavistock workshops that people had started, getting people to talk very intensively together. But people were very uncertain about how helpful these workshops had been. They were very intense. There was a lot of, afterwards, there was a huge amount of distress said by people who weren't quite sure what they'd been about or what they had achieved. So I, for my sins, thought, well, maybe there are easier or better ways of actually helping ourselves to talk with each other. And the result of that was, does anybody recognize the very first version of Community Conflict Skills? The very first one, it was self-published. I can't even remember, did we pay for it or who paid for it? But the reason I was proud was that I actually very much focused on trying to talk about tough issues. And it's one of the things I always say, you have to be able to do dialogue about tough issues. And it was rights, it was justice, it was politics, it was all sorts of things were sort of tried, as it were, in that. And I think it became almost a sort of a popular book. And I realized this one day now, I was coming back from somewhere and I was in a taxi and I noticed on the front of the seat, the taxi driver had this book. So I said to him, it looks like an interesting book. I said, what is it? And he said that he turned out to be a loyalist ex-paramilitary and he was working with a nationalist ex-paramilitary and they were using this book. He said, we call it the Bible. And I thought, there's nothing like success if you have 2 ex-paramilitaries using this book. That was probably the proudest moment in terms of that book. But subsequently, what was interesting was, probably most people don't know this, but this book found its way into 6 different languages, bits and pieces of it. I know there was Russian, there was Indonesian, there was Spanish, there were, and I would come across it in different places because it was a giveaway book. Everybody could take from it as they will. And again, that was something that we were proud of, but I was proud of, but thought it's a bit odd because there were people in Indonesia talking about the Falls Road and people in Latin America talking about the Shankle. And I thought, this is just crazy. So I said to myself at some stage when I have the time, and I want to redo this book, as it were, to make it a more open, internationally usable book so that people could use it in a generic sense rather than actually using it in terms of particular places. So last year, Sue Williams and myself, we sort of worked together on lots of things, but Sue and I decided that together we would put together this generic a version of this book. And we worked in the spare time that we had, ensuring that a lot of the same topics, the hard topics of justice, rights, all these political talking, all these things were still in there, but it is now available as a generic version. There you are. I'm very proud of this, not least because it's available free. You can download it, or we did it as a non-profit ourselves on Kindle. So I think it costs $4. It's actually a beautiful version. I don't know how they do it for $4, but they do. And that, in a sense, closed the circle for us. And, you know, I often think for that, there are so many people to be thanked in Northern Ireland. Many of these people I'm looking at, we actually did help so many other places to have the kinds of conversations that they wanted to have. And that took a lot of courage. Do you remember when we began to try and talk to each other about difficult issues, how tough that was, how we'd have to hide our names in certain places because we didn't want to be called Roisin or whatever in the wrong place? Those were not easy things to do. And I think that I think we need to credit ourselves with having been brave for ourselves, but also for others. And I wanted to finish by saying another proud moment I had was when about 3 or 4 years ago, an organization in Boston that Sir Williams has worked with called the CDC, I think it is, they put together a paper called How Northern Ireland Got to Peace. And it was written by Sue and by my husband, Niall, and I had nothing to do with the writing of it because I felt I wanted an outside external view. And if you actually look at that paper, I gave it to Rob and it's easily found. I think it was How Northern Ireland Made Its Way to Peace. What I want to say, people, and they asked everybody, politicians, security people, NGOs, etc. People reckoned that over 50% of the success of the agreement in Northern Ireland was due to the NGOs and the people who had worked in civil society, the conversations they had, and how that had helped to make us ready, as it were, to make peace together. So that was the story of this book. That was the story, your story, my story. And guys, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for sharing on that. And if anyone that has difficulty getting hold of that new version of the book or the paper that Mary referred to, you know where you can find us. Okay, so thanks, Mary. Moving on then now to our last speaker, but nobody could say about Michael Doherty that he is the least. Last but not least, he's a native of Derry and he's been involved with cross-community work there for many years. He's a mediator and a former director of the Peace and Reconciliation Centre in Derry. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be asked to be part of this group tonight. And it's great to bring back so many memories. I just realized, Mary, as you were speaking there, look what I had opened my fruit desk.
Second version.
Another version.
Another version of it. It was amazing just the way you said that. I'll begin to tell my story because it started with 3 particular violent events that I was involved in. 1968, I was working as a barber in Duke Street in the city on the 5th of October. Whenever the RUC at that particular point in time stopped the Civil Rights March. I was also there on Bloody Sunday when a young guy who was a member of the youth club that I was a part-time leader in was one of the people who was killed. I had just gone over the rubble barricade and he was behind me. It was only later that I realized how near I was when I saw what happened, when I realized what had happened. The third event that really brought me into peace building work was the IRA blew us up in our barber shop in Duke Street. We had moved to Spencer Road at the time because of the redevelopment in the waterside area of the city. We were still in the barber shop at the time. And I remember on a Sunday, looking at the building, the roof had fallen on top of us. We walked out of it, my father and I, and 2 customers. To this very day, I still don't know how it happened, but the upshot of that was he ended up being partially deaf. But I'll come back to that one because it's important for me in this sort of type of work that I'm doing, that I'm involved in. But I remember saying to myself, there are 2 narratives going here because we had known a lot of Protestant people. We came from a Catholic community working in the Protestant area of the city. And I got to know a lot of Protestants through the customers who come into the shop, got to know a lot of policemen, got to know a lot of soldiers. So I began to realize when I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what I was going to do. But I knew, first of all, I needed an education because I was out of school from I was 14 because I was taken right into the barber shop. Because at that stage, jobs in Derry were scarce. And if you were a Catholic in Derry, there's little chance of getting a job. So I had a job from I was 14. I was very lucky and very thankful. I reared 3 children from it. But when I was 33, I decided I'm going to go back to get an education. I did a foundation course in 1979 at McGee College in Derry. Then I went on to get a degree in social administration in Coleraine. Then I went on to Jordanstown to do a master's degree. And all of that time, I was wondering what I was going to do. But by the time 1986 came along, the Department of Education then put community relations part of the core element within the youth service. And I remember money became available for youth service personnel and projects. And I became one of the first community relations project workers based for the Northern Ireland Association of Youth Clubs, who later became known as Youth Action. But I was based up in the Northwest in Derry. And I remember all the good language was about tolerance and diversity and good relations and all the stuff that was coming about at that time, but not really knowing what we needed to do. And it was with Mary's book, along with Anne Dixon, Mary herself, and Chuck Richardson, who later became Spirit of Enniskillen. The four of us sat down. We had designed the first ever community relations course that was delivered to the youth service. Later on in 1990, whenever Mary was director of the Community Relations Council, Fergus Kaminsky and myself designed the first ever Action Learning Programme. And that was a programme where we were training youth workers to go out to deliver community relations work and then coming back and to talk about what was working and what wasn't working, what was best. And from all of that, we decided we were spreading out the message that community relations and dialogue needed to happen. We had to find creative ways to do it. But what struck me most and where I get into the whole mediation role, I think Jeffrey Curry, I think you were involved with Joan Broder and the late sister Christina O'Neill in California doing the first Quaker Peace Education Program. Whenever you come back, Joan Broder and the late sister Christina delivered the first program for me up in Derry.
Yeah.
I think it was 1988 or 89 at the time. And I got hooked into mediation. And for a long time, I'd been working mediation Northern Ireland. We're also doing some training. I think John Paul Lederich was heavily involved at the time. But Bill Clinton came in 1995 and he offered places at universities in America. That was teaching a course that wasn't being taught back here. And the University of Ulster, through Seamus Dunn, I applied for 20 places at Fordham Law School, and I was one of the people who was selected to go on that crash course. When I come back, 1996, 97 period was the beginning of the Drumcree crisis that was happening. And the Parades Commission was set up, and I became involved with the Authorised Officers Unit of the Parades Commission. And a lot of the work since then, for me, has been involved in a lot of stuff behind the scenes that nobody knows about. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things tonight. It's the first time maybe in a public arena and I've mentioned these things, because these are things that when you're working as a mediator behind the scenes, you've got to keep that whole notion of confidentiality true. Because if confidentiality is broken, the whole thing falls apart. But for me, what was happening was some of the mediators in those earlier days were getting blamed for what was happening in the praise issues. And I began to wonder, why are mediators getting blamed whenever the part of our remit is to remain impartial during all of this? I began to look at the training we were receiving right across from America. It was happening here as well. I began to look at the different models. One was called Facilitative model of mediation, which would be following the Quaker, where you do not give any advice whatsoever to any of the disputing parties. And the other one was Evaluative Mediation, where the possibility was that the mediators could evaluate the pros and cons of each situation and then offer advice as to how it could get sorted out. But it was a clear understanding, it was up to the disputants to make the final agreement. And I began to realize that we were mixing up the two models. And I began to focus directly on using the facilitative mediation model only when I was doing the work that I was involved in. And I became very true to that work. Now, what was happening was, because the loyal orders had refused to talk to anybody from the Trades Commission, it was making it difficult for everybody, because we had to find creative ways as to how to get people into dialogue. And I know for a fact that whenever my contract wasn't renewed with Mediation Northern Ireland, that it opened many doors for me, because I was able to talk to the loyal orders and because I hadn't got the shackles of the Trades Commission on my back. And what was happening was, we were finding creative ways through shuttle mediation to try to get dialogue and messages going. And John Paul Lederich referred to me one time as an insider parcel. That is someone who comes from one community but is trusted to work in the other community. And that happened for me on many occasions. Now, the one occasion,
Michael, you've got a couple more minutes there, okay?
well, the last part I want to say is one of the things that happened for me was, and this is when I talk about confidentiality, I was caught up in the middle of a death of in a particular area where I had been working with a person who was killed long before, while we were trying to sort out a parade. And I was at a meeting with loyalists and police, and somebody within that grouping divulged something that I had said outside of that meeting. And I realized I was compromised of trust in this whole work that we were involved in. I became involved in this work to stop our community from killing each other. What we have succeeded in doing at the present time is transforming our conflict to be less violent. We have a lot more work to do. We're still living in the conflict, but we think we're out of it. A lot of academics refer to our conflict as being in a post-conflict situation. We're not. We're in a very dangerous situation at the moment because of the protocol. We all know this. We all know how it needs to get sorted out, but none of us are prepared to move from our fixed positions to do that. We have not dealt with sectarianism in any shape, form, or fashion. It's alive and kicking. And I know somebody once did said, it's like a glass curtain. We don't realize it's there until we walk into it. And I'm beginning to come to the grey end of my work, beginning to realize we have as much work to do now as we did whenever I started back in 1986. So good luck to the young people who are coming on board. I hope they find other creative ways that we haven't found yet to do that work. And I hope it continues. I know I'm passionate enough in my work to keep me at it until whatever happens for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing. And at the end of the half dozen speakers that we've had, I'm kind of thinking, it's a bit like the sort of the Northern Ireland sharing, something like speed dating, only it's speed speaking, because to try and share so much in so little time is absolutely amazing. And in terms of thanking the speakers, I would just like everybody to give a wave and hold up their hand and say thank you to everybody, because it's been absolutely amazing to hear. I'm now going to move towards discussion groups, so I'm going to stop the recording and I'll then give you the information about the discussion groups, and we'll not be coming back to this plenary session. So thank you, speakers, and thank you, participants, and there's now the opportunity for small groups.